Okay, welcome to episode 25 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, we got to the Super Bowl, right? We're here. It's Chiefs, it's Eagles. I tweeted this out because I wanted to give the listeners a little bit of a heads up. You and I are going to be going to the Super Bowl next week. We are going to, because of my great friend Matt Stopsky got us on a bunch of radio hits, and I find, and you've been a part of a bunch of Super Bowls, both as a GM and then as a director of college scouting and that kind of thing. These 2 weeks, I feel like, are the longest 2 weeks of content in sports history. And I feel like our promise to you at Sumer Sports is to be different than all the content you're going to see everywhere else. And specifically, looking at these two teams, the Chiefs and the Eagles, from how they've been built, and what that means for teams trying to emulate them. Because ultimately, let me know if this is true, Thomas, as if you're one of the other 30 GMs in the NFL, are you looking at these two teams and saying, hey, what is this prescriptive? Is there a blueprint here for us? Does that ever go through your own mind?
No question. Again, they both have so many positives to all elements that they have. And I, as a general manager, would step back and look. Usually, personally, I would look at the top 5 to 6 or 7 every year, and I would try to glean as much as I could with their approaches. And if we were lacking in a certain area, whether it was pass rush or whatever it was, we would go there. We would really hone in on that. We'd also hone in on the coaches they were using and the style of coaching, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a really, really good thing. And I always tell my friends that are the GMs of those teams, honestly, Eric, sorry, I know you're trying to be really private and you don't want anyone to jump on, but we are analyzing you up and down every step of the way. So understand that. Take it as a compliment.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, Ollie, we really appreciate you coming. That voice makes me proud, Eric. Look, I let myself get romantic about football a couple times a year. It was really fun to see some of my actually both sides, like one of my old interns, Zach, as well as Sarah, who worked with me at Wharton as well. They're both on the Eagles. They get to go to their first Super Bowl, both Wharton Moneyball alumni as well. And of course, with Kansas City, Brett Veach, Brant Hill is one of my good friends there. Just really fun to see them, get to go to the Super Bowl. And, especially in a year where, they took, and we're going to talk about wide receiver and Tyreek Hill and all that, in a year where Kansas City took, I think, some risks of roster building, seeing that pay off this year was really fun. So, yeah, I lost my voice a little bit, basically rooting, in those games. And, it's so much fun. But I think that's really a good point that you said. It's not just the top two teams. It's also, and you go back to last episode of our podcast, which was the most listened to podcast we've ever made. It was the most listened to week that we've ever made. So we really appreciate all of you, where we talk about all 4 teams and how they've been built. And I thought that it was a really insightful conversation about all 4 of them, because they've not all 4 been built in the exact same way.
Interesting enough, because I obviously my receiver drafting and moving and dealing with Julio Jones. It's not just about Julio, but there's so much there, so many lessons that I've shared along the way with Julio as an example. It's not easy to do, of course, right? And I know we're going to get into that, everything we're talking about from a receiver standpoint. I just can't wait to jump in, because there are nuances to receivers, not only evaluating of them, Eric, but how you're placing them. And you had a great point earlier on, and I love your insight on it. It's not just going out there and just running roughshod over people and trying to get the best. Of course, you want the best receiver group, but there are many elements to it that I think if you're creative with it and you're very thoughtful, and oh, by the way, you if you're a GM, you augment with Sumer Sports and what they offer, right? You're supposed to smile on that. Then I think you take that really interesting look at your receivers, and potentially it plays out something in a different way than you might have thought if you were just going at sans the data and just going it off of your eye.
Yeah, on-air production meeting, there are times every once in a while where Thomas will say something and my face is like not the right reaction. And it's because I'm trying to like post something on Twitter about the show to make sure that everybody's watching. And so every once in a while, Thomas is like, Eric, like you made kind of a weird face when I made that statement. I'm like, I promise you that it wasn't because of what you said. I was looking over, some numbers related to who is listening to the show and all that kind of stuff, or even a comment that a lot of you post on the YouTube that catches my eye. So, but yeah, the Julio Jones. Let's just get to this idea here, because Julio Jones represents something as a wide receiver that I think growing up, when you look at the 70s, 80s, even as passing became more and more ubiquitous in the NFL, that kind of receiver represented what the ideal was, right? And I think about you think about the Niners with John Taylor and Jerry Rice, right? Who was the third wide receiver on those dynasty Niners teams? I don't remember. Like, I actually, Mike Wilson maybe was one of their names. You look at the Falcons when they made their first Super Bowl, the one before yours. It was like Terrence Mathis, Tony Martin, Tim Dwight was the third guy. And I make a joke, and this is not necessarily all that PC, but you have two like stud wide receivers, and you bring a little guy off the bench to be that third guy. The problem with that from an evaluation standpoint, Thomas, is your bar for scouting and drafting wide receivers is so much higher, right? Because you really did have to get a Julio Jones in the draft for him to be that kind of player that you could win with, because that guy had to play all the snaps and he had to win. When the cornerback was jamming him inside, when he was jamming him outside, you have to win against tall corners, small corners. You have to do everything. And I fear, and this is at somebody, I played wide receiver in high school before I moved to tight end in college. Like, I feel like wide receivers, there's so many more types, and to shoehorn certain guys into certain roles is just a recipe for disaster in the NFL, and it makes your job as an evaluator harder.
It definitely does. I mean, look, let's step back for a second. I know I've shared some of this, but again, think big picture. You're trying to put together the best offense you can. You're trying to surround your quarterback, i.e. for us, Matt Ryan, where as he was growing, we wanted more and more people. And by the way, I did take that lead from Bill Polian. I just loved how Bill put people around Peyton back in the day. And I thought, come hell or high water, we were going to do that. And we did it. I look back on it, and this is no disrespect to Matt Ryan. We gave Matt Ryan everything that he needed as far as the skill players, the receivers and tight ends and running backs through the years, and receivers, of course. We wanted to provide him with as much as we could, of course. When it came down to Julio, quickly on this, thinking about it, we had Roddy White as our number one, and then we drafted Julio to be our deuce, who was ultimately going to be our number one, and then we were going to have to replace to get a number two there. We haven't even talked about threes. And then, again, as you know how that worked out, we have Julio moving into our one spot. We draft Calvin Ridley, right? Because even though Calvin wasn't the big guy like those two, Julio Jones and Roddy White, he was another guy that was going to rip it off the top. He was a separating phenom. I mean, there wasn't a guy that ran a better route in my mind that I had looked at. But when you start talking about putting together that really strong 1 and 2, and now, as you alluded to, that third is your third starter. And that third is so important. It's important because, quite honestly, if you're thinking about it, and your receivers, especially those studs that are unbelievably athletic, they're wound so tight, literally and figuratively speaking, that they, unfortunately, they can pull sometimes, right? It doesn't matter. It could be Cooper Kupp, it could be Julio Jones. Those receivers, man, they are athletes. And so you have to make sure that you have the 1 and 2 and the 3 for sure. And your 4 has to be a legitimate 3. And we're always talking about what is the upside of these receivers, because we know they are going to have to step in when there is an injury or something goes awry. Really important part of this, but I'll toss it back to you on that. Look, vital, your receiver group, along with your tight end. We won't get into tight ends right now. I know that's your love, and we'll get you talking about that.
I think we have to do a whole episode on tight ends, because I feel like it's a much different eval, isn't it?
It's a much different eval for sure.
Yeah. And just from an analytics standpoint, what I'm looking at, and there are like what I would call traditional metrics, and then there are advanced metrics. So one traditional metric is what's called yards per route run. So, Pro Football Focus had this for a while, but basically, yards per route run is the number of yards receiving that you get per every time you run a pass pattern. So you'll take out plays, like let's say you stay in the block, or it's a run play or something, you throw that out. And that is a pretty stable metric. And when we say stable, what we mean is if a guy has a high yards per route run one year, it's going to be high the next. Julio Jones was like the god in this. He was one of the few few players who could touch 3 yards every time he ran a route. Now, some of that was the Falcons offense would take him off the field on run plays or some, 21 personnel plays. But some of that was just he's super effective, of course, a Hall of Fame player. And yards per route run captures a few things that are really, something you would evaluate as a talent evaluator. One, if you're out there and you're running routes, are you your quarterback's favorite target, right? Because there's another one where you think about yards per target could be a problem because, like, if you're a player who is opened up by all the other players on your offense, then yards per target could be misleading because you're wide open. John Taylor's a perfect example of this. John Taylor, the former 49ers wide receiver, who's amazing, made Pro Bowls in his own right, but he was a guy that averaged 10 yards a target. Well, why did he average 10 yards a target? Well, A, his quarterbacks were 2 Hall of Fame guys, Joe Montana and Steve Young, and B, Jerry Rice took everybody's attention. So when you threw to John Taylor, it was because he was wide open, because everybody was going after Jerry Rice. The signal there is in the fact that Jerry Rice takes the coverage away, right? And so yards per route run is going to give you this idea of, do you command the football, right? And are you productive with it when it goes your way? And so that was the big one. That was before we had any tracking data or anything like that. It was just simple division. And you would go through and say, this is what we're cutting up here. And that would be, so for example, Calvin Ridley, when he was at Alabama, 2.31 yards per route run, one of the best marks in all of college football. And so you look at him as an evaluator, like, well, look, Alabama's a blue blood program. Calvin Ridley is on the team and they choose to throw him the ball, which means that the quarterback has a choice of all these other great wide receivers and he goes to Calvin instead, right? That's a signal that the fact that he's good. Now you can break it down and I want you to talk about what you're looking at as far as route running. But that's the first place I go. If a guy's on the field and his quarterback's not throwing him the ball, then something's wrong, right? If he is, then I'm filtering out those guys for whom the quarterback prefers. And from there, you can kind of look at, well, does his skill set translate from the college to the NFL?
Yeah, it's a really good point. If they're not going to the really athletic guy on the field, or sometimes those guys fall through a little bit, and we as evaluators might see the pure athleticism of a player who maybe has gotten the ball thrown to him 15 or 20 times versus 80, 90, 100 plus. And you're wondering what the issue is. And, Eric, honestly, it allows us to really dig deeper to find out. Sometimes the coaches at these colleges will let us know why they're not throwing to that guy. Other times there are other elements there that are there for many reasons, right? I hate to keep bringing this. It could be character reasons. It could be they're not leaders. It could be they haven't worked hard. They could be in the coach's doghouse. There's a lot of that. Every once in a while, you can find a really good player that just slipped under, and they're around a group that there were just so many players like it in Alabama that just didn't get his opportunity for that reason. And they're kind of late bloomers. So I 100% agree with that. When we look back on, and we will talk about that. I know when we want to come back to basics as far as, evaluate, and I'm looking forward to doing that. But the very last thing, just to bring it back to when you're looking to pull a really bona fide receiver to turn your program around. And for us, of course, it was JJ, but we were looking, and I remember this, and I think I've shared this with you before. I mean, I was looking personally for someone to tear the top off. But again, this wasn't about always throwing to him 15 balls a game. It might have been only 4, but we want the defense to be on the heels for the other 10 times just because they're worried about him possibly getting the ball, right? That marquee player has to be in your group. But the 2 and 3 can be a lot closer together than what Eric was talking about a little bit earlier when it was just these 2 guys, right? So it's things have changed some, yeah. And I think that's really important for us to continue to talk about.
Really interesting though, because this is a thesis I had. So Kansas City, we'll talk about constructing a receiving core, but it's really important though when you look at money allocation to a team, right? So Tyreek Hill was making 20-ish million, and he was about to make 25 million for the Chiefs, and yet he had been that guy that you're talking about, the guy like a Julio type where down the field, the defense respects him and the offense opens up because of him. The problem was that these defenses would run these too high shells that would almost eliminate the Chiefs' ability to just drop back and throw a deep pass, right? Because you're just not going, and teams on offense against Kansas City would just would run the clock out so much that the Chiefs would only get so many possessions. So they had to score on every possession. So, and last year, the Chiefs in 2021 led the league in points per drive, but they also had the fewest drives in the NFL, which showed you kind of what teams were doing when they were trying to basically make them cross the street 10 times on the way to the end zone. And some, and hopefully you'd make a mistake along the way and you have to settle for a field goal. And being able to get a 70-yard touchdown was just not something teams were letting them do. But then the problem was in the incentive. So Tyreek Hill in 2020, his average depth of target was about 12 to 13 yards because, teams still hadn't figured out that they could defend him that way. And then in 2021, he still had similar production, but his average depth of target was about 10 and a half yards. And so they had to start using him as an underneath guy. The problem is there wasn't a wide receiver on the roster that could run off the safeties and that teams respected. And so when I was looking, and I use tracking data to sort of, factor this in. So again, this is second level stuff, looking at how a guy can get open, looking at how, and I proposed this. I was like, well, they need to get a deep threat on this team, even if Tyreek Hill is on this team, because you're going to throw the ball to Hill. He makes too much money for him to be a decoy, right? You can't have him run those deep patterns and not get the ball. There's team aspects that'll screw you there. And so that was why I basically made a petition for them to sign Marquez Valdez-Scantling of the Packers, because he had that sort of impact on Green Bay. He was not a productive guy, like catches, yards, and touchdowns, but when he was on the field, the offense did better because it opened up stuff for Adams and the tight ends and stuff like that. And that was, obviously it worked out last night, but like there's this aspect of looking at how teams are playing you and looking at the skill sets that these players have and trying to essentially Tetris those skill sets together so that your offense can beat any kind of defense, because that skill set is on the field at any one time distributed among your wide receivers. Is that an evolution that has taken place over the course? Again, going from two great wide receivers who can do everything to like a group of five. Like when you made the Super Bowl in 2016, it was Julio who kind of did everything. It was amazing. You had Aldrick Robinson, who was a guy who took the top off the defense. Not a terribly productive guy, but the guy that you had to respect. Taylor Gabriel is a horizontal guy. And then Mohamed Sanu, who's kind of the possession receiver of the group. And like, so on the field at any one time, all of those skill sets were represented on the Atlanta Falcons. And that's why, you average like 9.5 yards a pass attempt that year.
Yeah. And it's really important to know, again, like we've talked before, number 3, 1, 2, and 3, again, starters, 4, 5, and 6, depending on what you have, 4 and 5 have their own, they have their own responsibilities, of course, and focus could be, they definitely 4 and 5 need to have a presence on special teams, right? And this becomes a little complicated, right? You're trying to get the best receivers there, but you also know that those positions need to be on the team's side of it. They need to cover, they need to run down the field, they need to return, they need to block. Like they need to be versatile there. And yet what happens sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, someone gets injured and one of those 4 or 5, number 4 or number 5 have to move up to 3, which again is a starter. You pray that guy still is, special teams aside, that he's able to do what he needs to do, because you can't go out in today's world and just have 2 receivers, as you have said. So it becomes complicated, right? There's a lot there with how you're navigating through that. And this comes back to when I start talking about offensive coordinators utilizing your talent right? And I'm a huge believer, and I've said this before to you many times, your coaches and their substitution is vital. And if you have a coach in there whose head is all wrung out for some reason, I'll use a different word, of course, if I weren't to be on air, and he's subbing the wrong guys, and on third down, a Julio Jones isn't on there, or Mohamed Sanu isn't on, or even your ideal number 3 isn't on the field. You can literally piss down your leg as a team, and you have all the talent there, but you have to be right with how you're subbing and how you're interacting, how you're getting creative with the talent that you do have. You don't always have to have the best in the world. You can have good players. Again, remember in our grading scale, you could have a number of 6s. You don't have to have the 8s and the 9s, which are the rare and the excellent and the rares. You can have a good football team with, back to your point, with DBs, secondary. You can have some good players across the board in those positions. And man, I think it can be hugely beneficial to the production of your offense.
Well, that's one of the articles I wrote in the show notes. If you want to look back at PFF, where this is after the Chiefs lost the Super Bowl to the Bucks, and I when I looked at that game, I was like, when the Chiefs won the Super Bowl in 2019, Sammy Watkins had 100 yards in the AFC Championship game, and then like a 95-yard game in the Super Bowl against a very good San Francisco defense. And when they lost to Tampa Bay had spent, day 2 picks on the secondary for like 4 straight years. And they had Sean Murphy-Bunting, they had Jamel Dean, Carlton Davis, they had Antoine Winfield. And when the Chiefs were down Sammy Watkins, like he wasn't healthy, and they only had Hill and Kelsey, and their offensive line was broken up, they couldn't get open in under 2.5 seconds. The Bucks outnumbered them. And so I went into the data and I looked, and I found that in a game, your offense's performance is dictated by your number 2 and 3 and 4 options more than your number 1 options. And in fact, in the playoffs, your number 1 receiver hardly ever influences. Of course, it's weird to say this, but the outcome of your team is the least dependent on how well your number 1 receiver grades. And so you think about that, like in this world, right? Your great year in 2016, you had many great years, but the year where your offense was historic, you had Taylor Gabriel playing his best season in the NFL, Mohamed Sanu, obviously, Austin Hooper. Now, tight end's a difficult part of this discussion. When we talk about Chiefs, it's always underlaying the fact that Travis Kelce might be the best tight end of all time. But, you look at the Packers, like when you play, the bad Detroit Lions, the bad Chicago Bears, bad Minnesota Vikings, 6 of your games a year, and their secondaries are always hurt, then Devontae Adams can win, right? And you can win 14 games doing that. But when you go up against, the Bucks in 2020 or the Niners last year, and all those guys are healthy, all the teams that make it to the playoffs have healthy secondaries for the most part. And if your secondary guys can't make plays, then the number 1 receiver, they're going to figure out how to stop it, right? It was a Belichick thing. If your number 2 and number 3 guys can't make plays, then it shows up in January way more than it does during the regular season.
We as teams would chomp at the bit when we were coming up against teams like, as you're describing. They had a stud there, but we knew we could take them out of it. I mean, for the most part. And you hit the nail on the head. And I love that, because I think it allows you to come in, as Sumer Sports will do, right? When we start talking about optimizing rosters, it's easy for us who are evaluators at the core, Eric, to say, man, I'm just salivating over that cat. Look at him. He's such an athlete. He can run. He can do all these great things. And it's easy to get caught up in that, right? Mm-hmm. And the more you're in it, though, the more you realize, again, a tweaked hamstring or an off game, because that can happen, or most often your quarterback's not getting the ball to your big guy, and all of a sudden it falls off the edge of the earth, and you have nothing. And even if and then on top of that, if your run game is pedestrian, mm-hmm. It is a bear to try to get out of it.
Yeah, and that was. We talk about last night's game, the Chiefs game against the Bengals. We saw it a couple different ways, right? The Bengals only threw for 238 yards. They were a team where you had Jamar Chase, amazing football player, top 5 pick. T. Higgins is about to get not a record setting, but a market deal. Very good player. Tyler Boyd has been there for a long time, former 1,000-yard receiver. Their number 3 got injured in that game. And now, Chiefs are playing 3 rookie corners last night. And against that kind of offense, you take Tyler Boyd out of that equation and you're like, wow, like the part of the NFL is not just your best beating their best, but it's your third best beating a weakness, right? Like you want to, and you look at why the Chiefs won that game last night. It was because their defensive line beat the Bengals offensive line like a drum when they had injuries in the offensive line. And you want to have that same factor. The Chiefs lose L'Jarius Sneed early in the game, their best corner, and the Bengals, lose their third best wide receiver. And so now all of a sudden that third versus third matchup, which would have been a huge edge for the Bengals, is kind of diminished, and the Chiefs are able to overcome. They're able to compete there. You look at the other side, and again, this clouds everything. And one of the reasons you were so successful in Atlanta was your quarterback, was very good. But you look at the Chiefs, Juju Smith-Schuster goes down. Kadarius Toney goes down. McCole Hardman goes down. So they were down to Valdez-Scantling, Marcus Kemp, who's a special teams guy, to your point. Somebody asked about Eric Weems, which I'm sure brings you back a little bit. And then Sky Moore, a draft pick of theirs. Those were their 3 wide receivers. And that was what Mahomes was working with against the Bengals. And it's like, that was when Valdez-Scantling had to step up. All year, Valdez-Scantling was kind of like the 3rd or 4th option on the team, not super productive. But the fact that he existed and he could actually take on a few of the roles that existed on the roster that were different than his main role during that game showed resiliency in that offense when it mattered the most. And when, as you said, guys get injured, guys are ineffective, defenses play you differently than you expect. Having that versatility is really important, and having 6 guys that are really good in that room are sort of invaluable to the process.
And like I've said with the O-line, I mean, there are some really good receiver coaches out there that really hone in on the skills that they have. They're really good at substituting their talent, which, again, vital. I'll throw out one. I mean, Terry Rubisky is one of the very best out there. So is Jerry Sullivan. And what those guys do with talent is quite amazing, right? They hone their skills. They put them in the right position to be successful, and they press them, and they press them, and they press them. So if you don't mind, let's step back for a minute just on let's talk scouting 101 for a minute regarding receivers. When we write up receivers as evaluators, we're writing them up for the GMs, or we're writing them up for the head coaches. We first differentiate between, is this guy an outside or an inside receiver, right? That's a really important thing for us. You can have guys that look like outside receivers but play better inside, and that's part of what we need to, as evaluators, really hone in and differentiate between what you have. So, when you're talking about an outside receiver, I'll start there. Of course, use of that outside receiver for everyone, of course, and forgive me for being a little bit basic here, but that's the guy. He doesn't need a ton of wiggle, man. You want to see that cat fly off the ball, burst off the ball, of course, take it deep. He's got to be able to tear the top off, right? That is a big, big deal. Where your inside receiver, he can have less flat out speed, but he has the ability to move. He's fluid in his movement, stop start ability, his ability to separate, which, by the way, before I get to just the snap to whistle idea, hands down, the most important thing, and you can take this to the bank. You can have really fast guys. You can have quick guys. Excuse me. It's the receivers that are really, really, really adept at separation. We've seen over the years some of those guys that maybe are a 4.6 guy, but they separate. We know that. I don't even know what we're going to give our guy out at the Rams, who we all love. But I mean, what does he truly run? Was he a 4.62?
Yeah, well, and that's a really good point. If you go to my paper, once we get our website, by the way, an update, we will have our website by the end of February. I'll post it in the show notes, but that was one thing. Cooper Kupp ran a 4.62 coming out of Eastern Washington. When we measured his true speed, like how effective he was at getting open and stuff like that, it was like more in that 4.45 range, which is not burner, right? That's not like John Ross, but it's also John Ross, by the way, doesn't run as fast on the field as he tests at Indy. But like, to your point, like, there is an aspect of being able to move when the ball is in the air, aspect of moving when, having that wiggle, to your point, that supersedes, any kind of measurement, right? And like all this stuff you're talking about, when you're evaluating Thomas, do you look at routes where he's not targeted? Because I think like that's also a big thing where you can get an edge as far as evaluation, because a lot of people just look at his targets. There was the famous one, your guy Les Snead, they track Robert Woods and how well he did in Buffalo, where the quarterback situation was not as good, respectfully, and he was getting open. He wasn't producing, but he was getting open off of the targeted routes. And that, obviously he went to LA and had a really good career there. It's all this stuff about stemming. It's like, it's shoulder to shoulder. It's, how do you set up a defensive back? How do you use your eyes? How do you use the field that's available to you? And to your point, like, when you're an outside guy, you have to have the strength to beat a press where you don't have a two-way go, right? You can't there's going to be some routes where you have to go outside no matter what. And, you have to be able to beat the press there, you have to be physical and strong and have long arms in a certain way, and win that way. In the slot, you don't have to be as fast, but you have to be quick. but you also have the opportunity of a two-way go if you're a slot player. And so there are different elements to that. And when you're looking at, when players are running routes, like, what are a couple of things that you look at as far as, I mean, are you charting these things? Are you observing them? Are you looking at, with strength, things like that? Because a lot of guys come into the league kind of skinny, like Devontae Smith, and they end up being effective. Like what do you look for there?
Those are all really good points, Eric. And I would say, again, from snap to whistle, the idea of the ability of this receiver to explode off, right? We've talked about quick twitch and initial movement at every position. It is vital. You can't be a lethargic, heavy legger, plotter type of person as a receiver. Oftentimes when we're watching receivers, and if they're plodding off and they're lethargic coming off, I mean, that is a real markdown on their grade. So it's the ability to get off fast. It's the body control and fluidity to run the routes, right? As they're running the routes, it's the ability back to body control as well to what we call gather their weight, right? Into their cuts. It's, as I mentioned, adeptness, the ability to separate, vital, as I've said, I can't stress it enough. That also has to do with athleticism, quick twitch, agility, all packed into the body control and fluidity idea. You're separating and then locating the ball, of course, which is big. If you don't have eyes and you can't locate the ball and you can't quickly see where you are and what you're going to do with it, of course, that is a really important part. True hands, but we just understand we also differentiate between hands, the actual hands, but also ball skills. We talk a lot about ball skills with defensive, with corners and safeties and defensive backs as a group. But the ball skill element of a receiver is really, really big, right? When you're tracking a ball, back to eyes, and you're able to track a ball and contort and get to a spot. Eric's probably smiling. He's probably thinking about himself in a big day when in his tight end days, when he was able to contort his body over there and get to the ball and not only make the catch because he had good hands, but because he could locate the ball and have the ball skills. Ball skills are really important. You're ready to interject. What do you got?
Oh, I mean, dude, you're absolutely right, because we think about drops, right? We think about drops as a statistic, but like that's sort of like baseball where we look at errors, but it's like you're too slow to get to the ball. They're not going to call it an error. And if you're not good at tracking the football, you're not even going to get, like on a corner route or something, you're not even going to be able to track the football. And so you might not drop the ball, but you failed as a wide receiver. And like there were a couple of times in my career where, you misjudge a ball and you're like, that's worse than a drop. Like I was open. I should have got the football and it's overthrown or underthrown because you took a bad angle. You didn't. And do you think, as far as, there are some offenses where the route running has to be pristine and precise, right? Like I think about, and you talk about the Colts where they had, Harrison and Wayne, and then they had Stokely and Dallas Clark, and, everything was super, Peyton Manning wanted that stuff done when it was done, whereas you have other offenses where things are a little bit more feel. When you scout, are you scouting with those two mentalities in mind where, this is an offense where it's more feel based versus I need this route runner to be precise. I need it. And that's where your relationships, obviously, like relative to somebody like Pro Football Focus, which is just grading based upon a rubric that's standard. That's where you can go to the coach and say, hey, Nick Saban, is Calvin Ridley supposed to run this route at that depth, or is it more of a feel thing? And is that why, they miscommunicated here? Or is that why every single route he runs is, why his hitch is a yard too short or something like that? Like, that's part of the evaluation too?
No question. I mean, look, the fit, just like scheme related, and the type of receiver that you're looking for, type of routes they're going to be running, back to the type of coach that will be working with them. If you get a coach there, quite honestly, this is why a GM needs to know not only his players, he needs to know his coaches inside out. Even though they're the head coach's comrades, you need to know that as a GM. You need to know what you're putting these potential stars, in whose hands they're putting them in. And if they're gonna reach their potential, or if they're not going to develop for other reasons. So it's really, really important, of course, to know what you're getting. And I would say you can get all starry-eyed over some of these guys that have all the athleticism, speed, and such, but are just not, coming down with the ball. They're throwing a different, as a team, we throw a different way that these guys are going to have to adjust. Look, one of the things that I think is the best thing, I love seeing a quarterback and a receiver in sync where they can put it on back hip and have, too much just putting it up there together all the time. It's set up to be knocked down. And when you get that receiver that has a really, really good feel of finishing the play, we've talked about this with other positions, right? Not only the visual, not only the tracking of the ball, but there is something about them with that mental awareness side to finish it in a certain way. And that could be at times putting your foot in the mud and coming back for the ball, reaching over someone versus waiting. Of course, aggressiveness, just to finish off the evaluation, not only the hands, but everything revolved around that, right? Are they high pointing it? Are they snatching the ball, pluck and grab, we call it? Are they right after they get the ball and their ability to rack, their ability to run after the catch?
Yep.
Are they sauntering after the catch? Some of these guys have all the ability to get there and make the grab, but for some damn reason, they don't finish the damn play.
Yeah.
Frustrates the heck out of me because they should be taking another 3, 4, 5, or 7 yards, and they're turning around, they're hesitating, and before you know it, they're taken down, right?
That was why there was such a kick in the NFL for probably 10 to 15 years about former running backs playing wide receiver, because they would get upfield with the ball, and you saw average depth of target sort of recede over time, and so guys that could make plays, obviously with a guy like Brady so efficient that way, yards after catch mattered so much. From an analytical standpoint, though, basically here are the statistics that are most stable, least stable. So for me, it goes, basically average depth of target. You own your target depth, and we're going to talk about receiving cores kind of that way. And then from there, it's how good you are at getting open. The separation is the most important trait, I think, in wide receivers, to your point, and the math backs that up. Then it gets to hands, and then it gets to yak. Yak is a really weird statistic because I think we look at it and we're like, that's a good yak wide receiver. And we don't look at the context, right? The offense schemes a lot of yak, right? Kyle Shanahan, a Niners team, I know they lost yesterday, a bad circumstance with them at quarterback, but he schemes yak open so much. That is obviously guys like Samuel and Ayuk being good at that, but it's also the scheme. Golden Tate, another one in Detroit, just amazing yak guy. But a lot of that was scheme. A lot of that was Calvin Johnson running off the defense and him having space like that. And then hands, excuse me, it's more of very noisy, right? Julio had bouts of drops at times. That didn't make him a bad wide receiver. Amari Cooper, another Alabama guy, had bouts of drops at times, but that didn't make him a bad receiver. It's, again, one of those where some wide receivers get to more balls. Well, for one, you have to get a target to get a drop. And getting a target is a positive sign that you're a good receiver. You also have to get your hands on some passes requires you to be amazing just to get, whereas a slower guy or a plotter might not get his hands on it. It might not be a drop. So drops, for those who are looking at the analytics of this, drops are sometimes extremely noisy. You don't want to have a guy who drops balls, right? But it's not, if a guy drops a lot of passes one year, that might not necessarily mean he sucks or anything like that. It might just be a weird random season on his end.
Yeah, those are all great points. And look, in the very end, when we start talking about the pure evaluation of these receivers and how they fit in, don't like underestimate the importance of these players having a feel, for the game. Back to that, right? There's something special about those guys, just like quarterbacks and other positions, of course, tight ends, I would say, the ones that are going to finish it, right? I look at a guy like, we were talking about Mohamed Sanu, right? Mohamed Sanu was a really important pickup for us when we had Julio, right? We had two big studs, Julio Muhammad after Roddy White left. That's a big guy, right? Strong as heck, competitive, will blow people up, could do different things. Quite honestly, just like the player that the Falcons have. Why am I blanking? Who has
Drake London?
No, I'm talking about the guy who was with you guys at the Vikings. No, way back. The running back.
Way back.
Running back receiver. Okay, this is not good for us.
Tim Dwight.
No, I'm talking about who's the stud at Atlanta right now who gets all the rushing yards. He plays running back for them.
Cordell Patterson.
When he came out, I remember, right? He was outside. He was underachieving. So sorry that I couldn't locate that name. That's horrible. It was just on my mind because I was thinking he was a guy that I was so surprised what they did with him there, of course, as a running back, but he can do anything. And I was talking about Sanu. When you get, the versatile guy, the Swiss Army knife guy who's tough, who's fast enough, who can catch, who has an understanding, man, you have special parts to an offense that can't be matched. So that's why.
And he had something like, and this was back growing up in Minnesota. You also saw this in a former guy who's now a really good broadcaster, Nate Burleson, had like the best balance I saw. Like almost never went down on the first hit. Like just, and Mohamed Sanu had that sort of thing where I never thought he was that fast. I never thought he was that even that quick. But like he just never went down on first contact. He had balance, and that's a wide receiver you want to team. He also has an absolute hose for an arm. I mean, you know this, but like he had the best arm on your team. I felt like as far as throwing the ball, he was just a really good all around player. And obviously, not to give you your flat, but when you gave him to New England, you got a haul back for him, which is kind of interesting. Back in 2019, a second round pick.
That was important for us. I mean, look, I remember having those conversations back between them and San Francisco to decide, and obviously ended up there as well. But look, the other part that we need to talk about here quickly, and I know we're coming close to time, and we're all mindful of where we're going to go. Receivers are not that easy as far as when you're a GM and you're talking about landing some big time money on a receiver. Very oftentimes, I mean, there's character elements. I'm not even talking about bad apples or anything. I'm just saying there are elements to that position for some reason. There could be diva guys. I used to always say, I mean, Julio was the most non-diva receiver I was around in those early years. I remember getting that. I would go to anytime I would look at receivers as a GM, I would go, even as a personnel director with New England, I would go to my sources and I'd say, please tell me, because we could never bring in divas to New England when I was with Bill and Scott. We couldn't do it. So you better have that figured out. So when I got to New England, or when I got from New England over to Atlanta, it was big for me. I wanted to make sure that we could deal with those guys. Now things can change. When some of those receivers have been around for another 5, 7, 8, 10 years, well, maybe there's an element of diva that comes out in the very end just for other reasons. But at the core, out the gate, if you have someone that's going to be high maintenance for you as a receiver, that's a tough decision. Where do we go? Do we take them and deal with them? I will guarantee it's a really tough thing to be able to think about 2, 3, and 4 contracts with a receiver that out the gate is a pain in your butt, but is a really good player.
Well, yeah, like one of my good friends, Bruce Gradkowski, played quarterback in the league. He said that Mike Tomlin's Hall of Fame case is the fact that he got Antonio Brown to the stadium every Sunday for 5 years in a row. And that's a part of it. And, as somebody like, I really liked playing tight end because you were involved mentally in every play. You had to block, you had to, and all this. Playing wide receiver in high school and early on in college, somebody respectfully just told me, Eric, you don't have like the mental makeup to be a wide receiver. You're not like a big enough asshole. Like you're too nice. You have, and you're not willing to walk over and tell the quarterback, and all this kind of stuff. And I used to post on my quarterback's Facebook page, hey, I'm open, and stuff like that as a joke. But like, I just wasn't like, you have to have, and football is so funny because, Bill Parcells famously said football is not a game for well-adjusted men. And I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think directionally it's similar. Like you have to be able to drop a pass and be like, I'm still the shit, right? You have to, get locked down by Richard Sherman for a whole game and be like, I still want the football. I'm still good enough for this. You have to, and you have to be out, you're out there on an island. It's that one position where everybody can see you. And if the left guard screws up, you and I will see it, but like the average fan won't see it. And so like it's a different sort of thing there. That is inherent in what's going on. And you think about guys like Terrell Owens. Terrell Owens was a menace, but the guy could play football. And the reason why the teams kind of continue to buy into him, as Mojal said, it's like is just that he was an absolute hoss.
Well, look, this is a long discussion. And you again hit the nail on the head. I mean, the a-hole factor could be present. How you as an organization deal with it, how your head coach deals with it. I, as a GM, would always look. I looked at Mike Smith this way, Dan Quinn. They both had different personalities at any position. How can you truly handle this guy, this position, this guy's approach? And just staying on receivers, making that decision, how far can you go? I mean, back to Tomlin doing what he did, right? I mean, those are tough decisions to make organizationally, not only the money involved, but how it affects the locker room, how it affects, how it affects the outside, the community, whatever it may be. And it's going to reflect on you as a head coach, of course. It's going to reflect on you for sure as a general manager. These are not easy decisions to make. And I can almost guarantee you, when you see a free agent out there for your team, you see a free agent out there, let's just say you need a receiver, and you're wondering and perplexed, why didn't they take that receiver in free agency? Or even more important, why didn't they draft that guy? I can almost guarantee you there's a reason, and it has to do with the AH factor, we'll call it.
Yeah, every time I've asked somebody in the league, and I have never worked for a team, I've worked with teams, I've always said, why didn't you draft this guy? They're like, he's a prick. And there's an aspect, Jimmy Johnson, who for my money is the best coach of all time. I could be wrong, but I think Jimmy Johnson, from my perspective, was the boldest, baddest motherfucker to ever coach in the NFL.
Yep.
He once one time cut a player for sleeping in a meeting, and somebody asked him, well, what happened if Troy Aikman, the quarterback, Hall of Famer, what happened if Troy was sleeping? He goes, I'd wake him up.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And you can do that a couple of times. You can do that a couple of times with a couple of players, and that's only if you're winning, right? So to Tomlin's credit, he only did it with one player, and the guy was Antonio Brown. All his personal things aside, is one of the best wide receivers to ever wear cleats in the NFL. He's an absolute amazing talent, and all that kind of stuff. But when you start making different rules for certain guys, you better win, right? Because otherwise, then people are starting to ask questions, right? And in a wide receiver room where you have 5 guys and there's only one ball, and the biggest jerk on the team is getting all the passes, that's causing consternation, right? So, and what I love so much about Jimmy Johnson, right, is obviously the trade, the Herschel Walker trade, and all that stuff was amazing, but also this idea of those Cowboys teams were full of those kind of guys, and they still won. But the anecdote is that he got fired relatively quickly because Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, realized that Jimmy Johnson was a little bit too much of an alpha for him, so they couldn't get along. And that, I think, the whole anecdote is what football in a nutshell is: managing tension, right? And I think when you build a team, you look at a wide receiver, you're like, is this guy a problem? Is his personality a problem, or is it a tension? You can manage tensions. You can't manage problems. So you have to be able to, and that's why they pay guys like you the big bucks to be the general manager, because the average person can't discern that, or the average person can't. And again, part of leadership is tricking people into doing what you want and make it what they want to do, right? And that that part of it is so integral to this aspect where the guy can get open, he get all the measurables, he can get open, all this stuff, and he's still not a fit for your team because of these personal things that we all ignore when we look at the spreadsheets.
Well, that whole idea of razor thin edge, I keep coming back to that, right? I mean, and again, imagine this, everyone. You sit there with your head coach as a GM, you call your owner up, and you present that you have this receiver that you're thinking about, and he's got all of these positives, but he has, all right, Thomas, it's usually like Arthur used to say, okay, what is it? What's on your mind? And I'd say, well, look, he's got all of this. I just want you to know he also has X, Y, and Z. And then we start talking about the X, Y, and Z, and we put aside the A, B, and C, D, E, and F, all the positives, and we're looking at those downsides. And then we look, quite honestly, you look at the head coach's personality. I said it earlier. You look at the assistant coach. You look at both the receiver coach and the coordinator. It's a big deal. And then you think about what's in your locker room. You have to think about, can we handle this? Not only in the meeting room for the receivers, but the rest of the offense.
Yep.
There's, again, that I think is where it's golden, man. That's where you step back, and it's all about a chess match, which I love and I could talk about forever. That's where I get really excited. It's not just the little fine-tuned things on, I love it. I love the elements of looking at movement and all of that. But then you step back, and if you have the right mind and you make the right decisions as a GM, big decisions. I'm not just talking about the 5th and 6th rounders. I'm talking about judge the GMs by their big time salient decisions. Those are the ones that really, I think, stand out.
Yeah, and you saw that last night in the press conference after the Chiefs' victory over the Bengals. The Bengals, by the way, a really good football. That was a fun game, wasn't it, Thomas? Just to watch those two teams duke it out. And Valdez Scantling, who, again, the Chiefs signed to a 3-year, about about $30 million deal. So not a cheap player, but not, a top of the market guy. He had been kind of like, again, their second, third, or fourth receiver, depending. And last night he had to step up and, I think he's 6 for 115 and a touchdown. And when they asked him about that, all he did was point out the other guys in the receiving room that stepped up, like Marcus Kemp, who's a special teams guy, basically. And I'm sitting there watching the game with my friend, and I'm like, why is Marcus Kemp on the field? Respectfully. And he makes a big catch. And that's all Marquez could talk about in that press conference. You're like, that's a receiving room where everybody kind of knows where they fit, right? And everybody, 1 week it could be player X, 1 week it could be player Y. And you look at, like, sometimes, this is going to get to my last point, sometimes the asshole is a guy you want on your team. I think about the 04 Eagles, the second to last Eagles team that made a Super Bowl. Terrell Owens was very good for that team, right? But there was a expiration date on his usefulness to that team, right? Because at some point it's too much, right? He has to go. And that was why Terrell Owens was only ever on a team for so long, right? Because it was just, and yet, like, Tyreek Hill is another guy, great football player, but eventually became too big for a team that already has a lot of big, personalities. He goes to Miami, does great. This now receiving room is a bunch of guys that build it up collectively, right? And so you don't ever have to have hard and fast rules of who you bring in, but you just have to, in this season on this team, can we take in a guy with this personality, or do we need to have a collection of people who work more together collaboratively? And it's why this team building thing, obviously we're going to do all, and look, our numbers support everything we've said today, but we're also going to have embedded into that, obviously, the intel of folks like you that have been in the building before.
If I could add one more thing to your point there, you think about, so you brought up T.O., right? I had heard stories about T.O. A lot of people want to carry the T.O. was problematic and concerning, as great as he was personality wise. Was probably, as we were kind of looking at our receiver situation, they were saying T.O. in those first few years when he was side by with Jerry Rice, awesome, like one of the best. When he became the dude and the leader, and I tell you, you can look at so many receivers like that, they just don't have, they're leaders in their own way by example, but when they have to be the stud and they have to be the leader, they don't know how to do it. They're tugging. It's all about them, but it's kind of not about them. They're trying to be a leader, but in the end, they're more self-driven, propelled. And then you have a tough situation, right? You're thinking, man, I got this guy. This guy's great. You didn't know that as a GM or as an owner, and you plop down a ton of money. All of a sudden, 2 years or a year after you pay him all that money, he's now the stud in the room, and your guy retires. You want to talk about your stomach dropping.
Growing up in Minnesota, you saw it 100%. Chris Carter was a record-setting wide receiver, very good. Obviously he was a minister, right? So he had the presence about him. And then Randy Moss comes in and learns, like, him and Jake Reed and Randall Cunningham was also a strong presence there. And Moss was on his best behavior for all those years, right? Mm-hmm. And then Chris Carter retires, and now Moss is squirting people with, squirting the official with a water bottle and running over meter maids and all this stuff. And you're like, oh gosh. And like, to the point where he's the best player to ever play for the Vikings, in my opinion. And they had to trade him to the Raiders for not all that much because the guy, they just could not work. And you guys finally got him in New England, right? But that he had been humbled, right? He went to Oakland and tried to play with Kerry Collins, and it was like things got pretty fair pretty quickly. So you guys got him for like a 4th round pick, and he was on his best behavior. He was playing with Brady, but again, playing, and you watch some of those NFL films, and when there's the NFL, the football life on Bill Belichick, where Randy Moss invites Bill Belichick to his Halloween party. And it's the funniest thing ever because Randy Moss was always this brash, abrasive, and one of the best players of all time, and objectively very good on television, by the way, very intelligent, very but an interesting guy. And he's had background. That's something also don't want to be judgmental of these guys. Had a background where I don't necessarily blame him for being that way. With the way he talked to Bill Belichick was, okay, this guy knows that he has to be on his best behavior when he's talking to the best coach to ever coach the game. And again, some teams have that strong presence at the coach, some teams don't. And again, it's all about those interconnected things where sometimes you can have a player like that and sometimes you can't.
Well, I was just going to say that you led me down the road. Bill Belichick and what he did with Randy and how he hung it over it. He did the same thing with Corey Dillon. I mean, you remember Corey. Corey, he always said to come in, and you're right, Randy's very talented on TV and one of the very best ever. You know, if they have a reputation, I'm not just talking about them. Like, there are players out there with wayward soul reputations, but when they come in, it's really interesting when they come into a situation that they are massively respectful of that HC. That is a big, big deal, right? It goes a long way. And Randy came in and Bill said, look, you play it my way. We will reward you beyond. You got to be with us, or we will. Yeah. But the greatest thing in the world I thought about Bill Belichick and his approach, or one of the great things of many, was that he was so direct with the players like that. You want to be with us? You want to win Super Bowls? You want to win championships year in and year out? You want to reach you want to reach high levels, and do what I'm saying here and we'll get you there. And they believed him. And I think that's amazing.
Yeah. That's a good way to end. I do want to end. We do get some listener questions. Here's one that's really cool. I think, Thomas, your experience could really help here. Matt Ungashik, who is on YouTube, question on YouTube here. On the road to Mobile, I've stopped at getting gas, so there's no texting and driving, which we appreciate here. I have never texted and driven in my life. So, anyway, first time at the Senior Bowl. Any tips for an aspiring evaluator?
So at the Senior Bowl, spent many, many years there, Matt. That's a great question. I mean, I have such fond memories of it. Move around the entire stadium. Don't just stay at one place. Go down near the O lineman. Go down near the D lineman if you can. I can't remember exactly how it is. For people who are non-NFL people, you obviously can't get on the field. Get to the different vantage points. And I think that's a great thing. I wish that I could recommend to you, who to speak with, because there are certain guys that are there watching on the peripheral. They're not in the middle of their pack. Those guys, sometimes when you're sitting next to them, lower down or higher up, they might be willing to chat a little bit. But look, take the vantage points and move around, because it's really, really fun to watch talent against talent. And usually, of course, the Senior Bowl is some of the best talent out there.
Yeah, and what I love, you also the Shrine Bowl, which was really this past weekend, and then that's going to be on Thursday. You have a Senior Bowl Saturday. It's an underrated week of football, actually, because it sort of initiates you to the upcoming draft class to a certain extent, but it's not the whole class, because juniors come out, of course. Thank you for doing that, Thomas. That was, hopefully people have gotten value out of the show. We really enjoyed doing it. Other than my voice, I think it's been one of our better shows of the series so far. So if we don't have anything else, we'll get everybody on the road here. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 25 of the Sumer Sports Show.